Welcome to day 133. We've got 2 Samuel chapter 24, 1 Chronicles 21, Psalm 30, and 1 Thessalonians 2. In 2 Samuel, God is testing David, and David fails, but he repents and receives forgiveness. Now, in verse 24 to 25, David buys from Aramah to make a sacrifice to God. Now, Aramah was willing to give what David needed to David, but David says, I must buy it. I'm not going to offer sacrifices to God that aren't a sacrifice to me. Now, I think this is actually a really interesting little moment here. We look at the choices that David is making. David could get what he wants for free. There's a freely given gift to David here that he can then offer to God. But David doesn't want it for free. David wants to make a sacrifice so that his sacrifice to God has personal meaning to him. And I think this is something that we need to be thinking about. Do we try to get things for free to give to God's ministry? Do we give our leftovers to God, such as old furniture when we're remodeling our homes, old vehicles, leftover supplies? Do we ask others to pay for our ministry through fundraisers and grants and going around asking people to give donations to our church? There is a time and a place for all of these ways to collect resources for God's ministry, but we must be willing to give sacrificially. This is what Jesus calls for us to do when he talks about the poor woman giving money at the temple when he's talking to the Pharisees. God in the Old Testament talks about giving our first fruits. So when the people of Israel re-entered the promised land after their time in Egypt, their first conquest was Jericho. And God's like, nope, you don't get Jericho. You're giving Jericho to me as a tithe, as a promise, as your first fruits, showing that you trust me, that I'm going to be with you through this process. So I think this is a big question for us. Are we giving the first fruits, the first part of our paycheck to God, and then supplementing with other sources for God's ministry? In 1 Chronicles, it specifies that Satan is the one that convinced David to do the census. Now, a lot of us just assume this is, the bad guy, the enemy of God, the king of hell. But if you read the Jewish Study Bible, they point out that this probably refers to a human adversary because it's usually in post-biblical times where Satan is infamous for being a heavenly being that is fighting with God. So don't read into this what we are used to reading into the stuff about Satan, especially the Middle Ages really changed our understanding of hell and the devil. And so when we are reading in the Hebrew Bible, we need to be careful that we're not putting some of the later Christian traditions onto this Hebrew writing. Now, a question we have here is, why was the census bad when the people were counted in numbers? Now, at this time, census across cultures in the Middle East was taboo unless there was a divine reason for it. And David didn't have a divine reason, therefore David was in trouble. Now, one note here is the story of the census probably happened when David was young. This is an example of where the text is not necessarily in chronological order. Remember, the Bible has many authors and it has many editors, and the time of writing and the time of editing is not necessarily right when something happened. Sometimes it is much later. In Psalm 30, we have thanksgiving for recovery. Solomon has built the temple, so the references to David is probably an anachronistic in here, again, out of time and space. Now, the image for the Israelites and Mesopotamian culture of raised from the pit or death at this time refers to recovery from illness. Now, these days we tend to look at this as a resurrection from the death, from dead, being dead. And so, again, keep in mind that sometimes there's a different cultural context for some of these passages. One thing to remember and notice as we go through here is that God's anger is short and it passes. God usually is life-sustaining. He provides good health, and God's favor is a positive thing. So as we think about God's recovery for a time of illness or disability, what is the health that we take for granted these days? We have vaccines, we have um, antibiotics, we have surgical techniques, we have all sorts of therapies. And I think a lot of times we kind of take for granted the stuff we have now that people in the time of the Bible did not have. And then we've got dancing as a way of praising God. And I know here in Wisconsin, a lot of us would be very uncomfortable with a lot of dancing in church. But around the world, even today in the Christian culture, there are many places where the Christian tradition does include dancing as part of the worship of God. As we continue in the first letter to the Thessalonians, Paul is encouraging us to be sure of ourselves in God. And here, I think one of the things we face a lot these days is a sense of anxiety. And I think this passage really challenges us to embrace confidence in God and to set aside our anxiety. The world is telling us we have reasons to be anxious. Paul is reminding us that in God, we have no reason to worry. Now, there is some anxiety that needs medication and therapy. Please use those resources when they are needed. But we can also use this positive reference to build up our confidence and help us to continue working towards a life of confidence and finding ways to set aside worry and anxiety in our lives. Now, Paul talks about not taking advantage of people and working for God and not patronizing. Not patronizing people, but instead caring for people as a mother cares. Here's one of the places where we see a female image for God. I know a number of us feel uncomfortable when we refer to God as she or as they, because we've grown up where the male references to God was the primary way of referring to God. But here we are encouraged to care for people as a mother does. And Jesus talked about God being a mother hen when he was looking at Jerusalem once. And so there is space for a female understanding of God. Both of the genders were made in the image of God. Therefore, God is both male and female. And so that's something for us to think about. What is our response when we hear references to God that are feminine? And is that something that we need to be aware of and stretch ourselves to make sure that we are not limiting our understanding of God based on our understanding of human gender? The apostles worked to support themselves and not be a burden to the people hearing their message. And Paul was constantly working as he traveled to be able to support himself. He encourages new believers for their faith. And I think one of the big things for us to think about as we're going through Thessalonians is how do we take time to encourage others? Good luck today as you encourage others, and we'll see you next time.